let me introduce now Robert Trebus, a director from D&B Fanblock, which is powering this session of the conference. Robert, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much. So I hope you all can see the PowerPoint right now. Yes, thank you first to Dr. Liu about going the way here for doing the conference on the digital way. And I'm very proud to join here and give you a short look into our new project, Fanblock system. So first, let me please introduce myself. My name is Robert Trebus. I'm the director of D&B Audiotechnik, and I'm the leader of the Fanblock project. And I like to explain to you about why we built the Fanblock system and what is the Fanblock system. So D&B Audiotechnik, we are nearly 40 years old. We come out of Germany at the Stuttgart area. We are over 600 workers with 14 sales offices and over 200 sales partners around the world. We are one of the global leaders in the pro audio segment. And the customers we have are the leading opera theaters, musicals, the sports stadiums, so house of worship, or any kind of venue location around the world. That's our customers. You will find them. And I like to talk to you about our project today. This is a new concept driven out of the COVID situation. It's talking about filling your stadium with sound instead of visitors. So we got aware of the situation beginning of March, April, that we had the first feedback that there was a problem with the audience attending the games, the sport venues, and we straight got feedback that even the broadcasters had problems, that really the viewers rate got down, and of course it direct affects also the brand value of the sports leagues and the club. And we are starting to think about what can we do as a pro audio manufacturer to acoustically compensate the loss of the audience? What is possible? And we had to run several studies on that, and we worked out what is necessary. And it's not very easy just to play back a sound and that it will be similar to a crowd atmosphere in the stadium. So no, you really have to find out the hierarchy of the emotions. It must be very dynamic what you play back in such an environment. And it's not easy one size fits all solution if you want to try to bring the emotions back into the stadium. And what we decided, we own a system that is shortly described as an augmented audio reality solution. We use that typically in concert environments and musical environments. And this is something you know from the video aspect, the virtual reality and the augmented reality. So what we do the audio part of that. And this is something, what we'll call also virtual acoustic. This is 3D audio, immersive audio concepts. You maybe know about that also from games. That is used also in games. And what we try to do is to bring that out of the games into your sport venues. So this is the next step. And a really important part of that is the thing that the composition, that what you play back, must be really a multi-layer, very dynamic sound composition. So in that, what we do in the events, we have bats, we have single actions, there are event-driven emotions, we have game-based emotions we play back. And if I try to explain how that works, I think the most easiest way is to tell you it's like an orchestra we have there. And there are conductors, they operate that in the stadium, and to make it really a great event, and to really try to bring back the emotions, even if there is no or very little crowd in the stadium. And as one of the leading pro audio manufacturers, of course, we also understand how to make that happen in all kind of stadium environments. We even can use it in indoor application, road events, alpine skiing, or all kind of other sport venues. And the concept we have created with Fanblocks has two different possibilities. We can use it for match field focus, to give the ambience to the players for the broadcasting environment, or we can use it to prepare the new normal. To have a system that works together when we reintroduce limited spectators into sport facilities. It's acoustically a quite complex situation, but with our augmented reality system, we are well prepared to do that, to bring the audio emotions back in all kind of sports facilities. So we use our DS100 single processor engine to make that happen in the sports venue location. This is something we know how we do that from things. And we have partnered with Autograph, a UK-based company. They come from musical business. They typically make the sound design and the immersive audio concepts for musical, and we partnered with them to bring that to life. But here is a little bit, you can see how that looks in reality. So we are able also to bring back the fencing, the fan chants together with the atmosphere. And what is important to see that we also have an API interface to link the FanBlock system to ball and player tracking system. So we also can generate audio out of these data. There's a high level of interaction. And we offer with a partner together a smartphone app where you can have a remote access to the audio environment. This is so with remote applause, but you also can send out emotions out of that. You can record small video sequences that can be bring back into the stadium and sum up together on the video wall. And we have here they called dynamic call to action buttons. This is something where we have a high level of interaction with the smartphone applications. We can link that direct to the merchandising shops. We can run that to surveys or sign up for a newsletter. And as you can see here in the video, this is real time. So in a sports environment, you can change the call to action within the tenths of a second on all running applications. So you really got a high level of opportunities to work with that. One of the issues we had also found out is, when you have sport games, they are broadcasted, you quite quickly come up in very, very huge latency issues with the people they follow at home, if this is a broadcast or a streaming environment. So what we have also here in the app environment, we call it the reality engine. So we make like machine learning out of the use parameters on the apps, a real-time statistics we use to create the audio background, and I call it the mood detector. And we bring, even with a latency environment of the streaming, kind of real-time feedback into your sports venue, into the stadium. So a short overview about the technical concept, so we have the sound engine, we have the immersive loudspeaker system, we have the live control, I call it for the conductors in the stadium, and we have the options to use smartphone for the people at home, or if you have partly filled stadiums and you like to have interaction from the people in the stadiums. And what I mentioned, we are prepared the system for supporting the new normal, so we can do that even with partly filled stadiums. This is what we believe will be the future. So we are prepared for the new normal to support that. And as I mentioned, this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. So we offer a very high level of customization. We have a lot of advanced monetization options to use it together with the app environment. And the feedback we got from the projects we just run, it's a very cool tool, a very nice tool to link up together with some sponsors, because this is really something they can present quite well that they support that. So a FanBlock system can be purchased, installed in your sports facility, or can be rented worldwide via our partners for half a season or seasons. So there's a lot of options there. So I'm more than happy to get your feedback to see how we can work together to live. And please get in touch with me, robert.tribus@dion.com, or sales partners around the world or sales managers. So I'm happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Hey, Robert, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Please go across to DNB FanBlock in the exhibit area. We look forward to seeing much more of you and your company in the months and years to come. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
The new normal will require some changes to our traditional risk management approaches. Our panel for this session is taking on risk, specifically managing the new risk post-COVID-19. Our panel today includes experts with backgrounds in intelligence, threat assessment, security, event operations, event management, and contracts and litigation. The panel may ask us to poll the audience on various risk topics. Polls will be open for 2 minutes, and you can see the results on your screen. I'd like to turn over now to Jeff Chapman.
All right. Well, thanks. I really appreciate it. I am getting dropped quite a bit, so if I do get dropped, I'll just dial right back in.
Okay.
I do hope that after I'm done, I'll try to keep this short and sweet, that the sounds that were mentioned a minute ago are more applause and cheers than they are laughs. So on the automated piece for the previous. So DNB, thank you for that. So I guess the part that I've been asked to talk about today is really how, as a part of risk mitigation, how you make use of information that pervades in the public sphere, and how you make use of it for your event, for your venue, whatever that may be. So I'm going to use a couple terms today that probably most folks have heard. One is called open source intelligence. The other one is called PAI, publicly available information. They're basically one and the same on the way that you would make basically use of this information to inform you, again, for the event and venue protection. I think, you know, over the last few years, and especially now in the COVID environment, you know, the security side has gone from physical risk to incorporating a lot more of the cyber domain. And, you know, organizations now are coming along. We work, Babel Street works with all types of companies and organizations, to include a lot of sporting events and leagues, or sporting venues, leagues, and teams. So we have a good understanding about this from around the world in different practices. And one of the things that we've seen is that because security and risk is generally a cost center, we are seeing entities play catch up on this. They're either understaffed or under budgeted in order to truly perform. And I'll talk through some of those challenges. But some of the new things that we haven't seen previously, that maybe, you know, we were looking for credentials as somebody came through a gate to make sure, and hopefully they spotted whether they were fake or not. Now you take that to the cyber domain, where people are being socially engineered. And so where they can find enough information about you or somebody with keen access to your facility, and how they might duplicate that and get access online, for instance. Obviously, there's a cybercrime element to this. Sometimes it's just because there's no other reason, just to show that they can do it. Sometimes they want money. Sometimes it's to get a message across. And so in the risk world, it's about staying in front of that and knowing what the likelihood and where those threat vectors come from. You know, obviously terrorism is always in the forefront of our minds, unfortunately, still, with what's going on around the world. So, you know, making use of information to inform you and the venue and the event as to what that might be is keenly important. And then bad actors continually tell folks, they like to brag about what they're going to do and what they have done. And so, again, to inform you. When we look at the use of this data, there's a lot of benefits that can be gleaned. First of all, there's a lot of data. So there's generally information out there that's going to inform you of something, and you may need more, but generally speaking, whether it's on the deep and dark web or whether it's on the surface web, which I'll speak about in a minute, information exists on something you care about. Generally speaking, now we've gotten to this world of real-time situational awareness. That's available. That can be done. When I say real-time, sort of sub-second, you know, sub-minute, depending on what you're trying to do, to inform you. And again, it's almost one of these you have to be doing now if you're running in charge of security or risk for an event or a venue. You know, look, the fan experience, what we're talking about today, the sentiment analysis, what are they saying? As an example of that, we ran some data from June 20th to July 27th on Major League Baseball's return. And roughly 50% of the online commentary about that from fans was negative about them returning to the game. Either they felt the experience wasn't really what they normally like. They didn't like the lack of fans. There was a million things they didn't like. I say a million, that's obviously a hyperbole. There are a lot of things they didn't like. And so informing ourselves of what that is obviously keenly important for all of us, because, you know, without fans, sports really is a tree that falls in the forest and nobody hears it. You know, again, keeping ourselves informed on the benefit side of what might happen, what could happen, people saying, like, if somebody says they're going to attack your venue and you're not listening, well, shame on you, because you could have heard that. And we run into, you know, a fair amount of folks that don't have anybody on their staff, nor have they outsourced that capability to other folks. Clearly, in post-COVID, we're focused on supply chain risk, and that can come in a myriad of different ways. whether it's maybe the NBA looking for a secure supply chain for their quarantine players down there, whatever that may be. It could be everything from a supply chain for badges, for access to you name it. So continuing on top of that. Now, this doesn't come without challenges. The challenges are replete and again, require some manpower and money. But the first is that it's the same as the benefit, which is there's a lot of data. So the benefit is there's a lot of data. The downside is a lot of data. So it's too much for a human to crawl through. You're gonna, without the aided use of software and analytics. So you're gonna need access to software, and you're gonna need some dedicated people, whether they're on your staff or you outsource this, to make sense of what you see there. The second, as we're starting to see, is an increase of regulations and laws and just your own ethics as to what you want to do with the data. And we're starting to see that now with how different venues use data for contact tracing and how that fits in your local jurisdiction of laws, whether it's GDPR in Europe or CCPA here in California, whatever those new laws may be. Again, staying smart in how to do that and having a partner that you can rely on. Who's not, collecting data dark at night and is looking to just collect a check and then disappear. The other challenge is, as we, in this global environment, are represented by the folks that are on the call today, is the languages. So, the dexterity that you need to be able to understand all the information that may apply to your event is high. And so having, a group of people or software coupled with software that can do that for you is going to be keenly important for you. And look, we're starting to see this with those of you that, maybe have watched the U.S. elections from afar, and those of you that are here see this every day in the U.S., which is the misinformation, sometimes disinformation. Some of it is intentional and some of it's not. People just don't know. And so how do you apply that level of analysis to your own risk assessments as to what it may be? What if somebody posted online, 3 hours before the event that they know of a security officer who got COVID and they're just not telling anybody? How do you respond to that, right? And so again, staying in front of that and understanding what's going on will continue to be of importance, great importance, as we assess risk for venues and returning to fan experiences. And I could go on with that, but I think COVID, is presented an interesting where we look at risk where previously I don't know that we saw global pandemics necessarily outside of certain areas of the world as a major risk and threat to the fan experience at venues. Obviously, that's changed. And, what I look forward to hearing from, especially Brian and others that are on the call, is the legal and ethical use of that data to continue to support the fan experience from a risk perspective, but also at the same time understanding privacy and mitigating those. And that's, again, I wanted to keep it short and sweet and answer any questions, but that's where I wanted to start out and talk a little bit about and turn it over from there. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Jeff. I'd like to go to Peter Dalton on all things hazards and threats. Peter, you there?
Yes, certainly, Ham. I'm going to share the presentation from my side, if that's okay, Ross. Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning. Pete Dalton. I'm an affiliate with the IIFX and a former police officer from the UK. We've heard over the last day or so all the impact of COVID-19, and unless you've lived far, far away with your head under the sand, you'll know that life itself and certainly events have stopped since last spring. However, though, the new threats that wait for us out there include many old threats, and today I'm going to talk about counterterrorism and protective security. And certainly the risk of counterterrorism or terrorism attacks on major events with hostile threat actors is increasing. Some may say that actually there's been no attacks at major events since last March. Well, guess what? Stadiums have been closed, but rest assured that terrorists have been planning throughout this period. There's an increase in step change in threat activity, and crowded spaces, as you'll hear, will remain as viable targets going forward. So just to start off, there'll be a poll question shortly. But here's a quick montage of major incidents and attacks at major events around the world. So right in the center there, a seminal moment from September the 4th and 5th, 1972. Many of you will recognize that as the Munich Olympic attack, where terrorists took hostage some some participants and coaches from the Israeli team inside the spectator village by breaching ineffective security. Over a 24-hour period, there was a negotiation, a failed attempt to rescue, and all the Israeli athletes and coaches were killed. Some of the terrorists were killed and some were captured. So a seminal moment there. Top left of the screen for our American colleagues is Centennial Square in Atlanta from the 1996 Olympics. It's indicating the circle there where a viable pipe bomb was deployed in a large rucksack in a fan zone. If it weren't for the prompt action of Richard Jewell, who was a really vigilant security guard who implemented plans really effectively, there would have been far more casualties. If you know the history, Richard Jewell then became a FBI subject of interest for about 88 days. And there's a really interesting film on that. The bottom left has been mentioned already, Stade de Paris in France, November the 13th, 2015. There were 3 attempted suicide bombings that were deflected from the outer perimeter. They'd intended to get inside the stadium. They were stopped from doing so and detonated. It then moved into a directed attack in the center of Paris around the bars and clubs, and it finished off with a significant hostage-taking scenario inside the Bataclan Theatre, where there's an American group playing. That led to a standoff, a raid by the police, and a high number of casualties, and again led to a systematic review of counterterrorism forces around the world. Bottom right for UK colleagues is the Manchester Arena attack from May the 22nd, 2017. A single suicide bomber detonated an explosive device inside a foyer on the egress phase when Ariana Grande was playing inside and led to 22 people killed and over 100 injured. Top centre, whilst not declared by US colleagues as a terrorist incident, was to date the largest mass casualty active shooting at an event stateside. Took place October the 1st, 2017. Stephen Paddock, who was a 65-year-old male, took residency in the Mandalay Hotel, 32 floors up, with oversight and overwatch of a large music festival, and killed 50 and injured many, many hundreds. And the top right for French colleagues is Nice Bastille Day, July the 14th, 2016. A large vehicle as a weapon attack. The single threat actor drove for about 1.4 kilometers down the Rue d'Anglais, killing 86, wounding over 400. So those events and many, many more have happened at large events. And sadly, they will continue to take place as well. I wonder at this stage, Chris, if you can just pop the poll question regarding the greatest threats to events, and I'll move forward with my slide. Okay, then there'll be a poll question shortly if the tech works that will ask you for your views. But whilst that comes up, I will just share with you some current attack methodology, the way that terrorists attack events. The first thing to say that's really important from a counter-terrorist point of view is terrorists plan, and they plan just as well, and on occasions even better than we do. And that planning phase is called hostile reconnaissance. And they'll look to assess vulnerabilities at your event. They'll look to assess your security, develop attack plans, and then work out success factors. And in front of you in the montage, you can see there the Boston Marathon bombing from April the 15th, 2013. 2 placed explosive devices in Boylston Street that detonated about 60 seconds apart, killed 2 or 3 people, injured many more. The suspects were later arrested, and they are highlighted on the top right of that slide, the Charnev brothers. The center right is in New York. The white vehicle you can see, a vehicle as a weapon attack, October the 31st, the Halloween horror show on the west side of New York. The threat actor had planned that event for over a year. On the day, hired a vehicle from New Jersey, drove across, mounted the attack, and was shot and apprehended by police. Bottom left, the large vehicle-borne explosive device that took place in Oklahoma. And bottom center, a frequent attack on police officers with edge weapons, knives, and axes. That particular one took place in New York in October 2014. There's been many, many more since then. And if you follow the European news, you'll have seen attacks in France and Nice in recent weeks using knives as a weapon. And then bottom right, Pasadena in Texas from last April 2019, a response to an active shooter who was a domestic terrorist expressing extreme right-wing views, and his manifesto is freely available online. So what we're saying here is there's a trend towards low complexity, low sophistication attacks where low numbers of threat actors can target events, and they will do so very often using a knife, a vehicle, a homemade explosive, or a firearm. The large coordinated planned attacks, such as Stade de Paris, thankfully are less frequent, and the long-term, long cycle planning attacks favored by Al-Qaeda, they are less frequent again for major events. What it means for you is to look at your event and to look at what the threat environment and vulnerability factors are. I've been involved in several thousand major operations over the years, and I can only think of two where we received specific intelligence that there was a threat towards the event. So don't assume that there'll be intelligence provided to you, and the absence of intelligence does not translate to an absence of threat in the counterterrorism context. So
Peter, let me interrupt you just there for a second, because the poll, we're going to close the poll shortly, but we need more votes. So please, to the participants, jump on the poll and vote away. Back to you, Peter.
Perfect, thank you. Do engage, folks, ask questions and do the poll. But things that make a venue or an event attractive. First of all, crowded places and crowded spaces. The current terrorist ideology and attack methodology seeks to target crowded spaces. Now, inside a stadium that's been secured by design and where there's a complex security operations integration, it's harder to mount an attack. So outside of the stadium, in a host city, in a fan zone, in a green space event, they are more likely. Events where there's ready access by vehicle, and even better if there's mass transit transport systems are providing a level of attack methodology. Events that are predictable. So events that are annual, it's easy to plan against. Events that are regular, you can conduct long cycle hostile reconnaissance. You can get inside the security operation, you can go to the event and make your attack planning very, very easy. Events where there's a lack of a hard perimeter. Now, most host country, host city, major tournaments, there'll be layers of events that go through the public zones, exclusive zones, outer perimeter, middle perimeter, into the city bowl. In the absence of those, events that take place in the public realm are vulnerable. So perimeter is really important. And if you've got a genuinely iconic location or an iconic backdrop. Now, the current main threat in Europe is from Islamic extremism. That's the current threat. What they generally want to do is to kill, proclaim, and die very quickly in sequence. And what they'd like to have is the backdrop for the media of Big Ben in London, Eiffel Tower in Paris, or a backdrop that's recognized around the world, because that then portrays their message. Locations where there are large numbers of international spectators from around the world, certainly the Western world, and certainly Western world, American, Brits, New Zealand, Australia, all viable targets for certain types of terrorism attacks. Events where there's a lack of security, which is less likely, but more likely, and sadly frequently, events where there is predictable security. Now, if you are a security manager, you're looking to have an unpredictable, unfathomable, ubiquitous security operation. Predictability is your enemy and the friend of the threat actor. Presence of media, either on site or nearby, allows terrorists to portray their message very, very quickly. And you'll see where attacks around the advanced world, live media kicks in within seconds, minutes, and then shortly afterwards. Now, the presentation from Babel Street of how quick social media gathers, the first tweets after the attack on London Bridge in March 2017, the first tweets were coming out 43 seconds after Khalid Massoud drove his car into people on the bridge there in London. Presence of police and military, people are often surprised at this, may attract the terrorist target acquisition, because police and military are seen as viable targets. Now, if you look at France, the UK, and around the world, New York, there's been lots of attacks on police. Even though the terrorists will know they're likely to be apprehended or shot or neutralized quickly, that's a consideration for you. Just a montage of those threat factors. So when you look at your event, consider those in detail, and that will inform you as to how you plan. Really important though, as I've said, COVID-19 presents a unique biosafety hazard, and there's been a massive focus on that. About 4 or 5 years ago, interestingly, there was a massive focus on what we would call hostile vehicle mitigation tactics to stop vehicle as a weapon attack, and people really focused on that area in isolation. So the message here really is security operations integration, and one of the key takeaways is the message from the presentation last night from the Council of Europe. When we plan operations and events, our concept of operations should have an equal focus on security, safety, and the service to the fans. They have to be planned together and it has to be interoperable. But here you can see the more traditional threats and hazards. So have you forgotten about protest? If you have, please don't. Black Lives Matter, geopolitical protest, environmental issues. If you've got a major event, you could be a target. The bottom left, mass transport disruption in and around your event. Top right, a structural collapse because of bad weather or high wind. So the Indiana State Fair from August 2011. Bottom center, if you like, severe weather warnings. Now, the environmental changes because of global warming are increasing the risk of bad weather and event cancellations and extreme storms. So it's a risk in itself. And then disorder on the pitch, fake tickets, and the new threat from COVID-19. And that COVID-19 threat, by the time that we go live and return to work, spectate, and play, is likely to have been reduced through biomedical science, vaccinations, fan passports, and screening. So again, please don't focus on COVID as being your single source of threat going forward. In terms of managing your threats, you need to have a risk awareness, a risk assessment management system. The one you can see here is ISO 31000, which is a model that we train to commanders and event management teams around the world. Not forcing this on you, but what this particular model will let you do is have a internationally recognized system that's competent. It allows for consistency and it allows for a systematic approach to both your risk management and your risk assessment. And the way you do that is to consider the unique context of your event, look at risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and treatment in a systematic way with consultation, recording, and review processes. And doing so, you're taking all threats and all hazards into the single management system as part of your safety, security, and service, and that concept of operations. Using models to prioritize, this one is a schematic from a mock event. You can then look at the likelihood, the vulnerability, and the consequence. Some risk assessment models will often focus on a 2x2 grid, so likelihood and severity, or severity and probability. By doing that, you miss out on more detailed metrics. By having a 3 system of 5x5x5, you can better graduate your scores and prioritize. This one is for an event, and you can see the most likely threats and hazards are crowd management, disorder, and alcohol and ticket issues and weather. They are the most likely at the vast majority of events. So whilst I talk about protected security, incident command, and major operations, has to be proportionate, scalable, and flexible, all taken together. When we plan our events, the first thing to do in terms of protecting security is to embed the planning process as part of your wider multi-agency planning. First of all, look at the context of your event. Secondly, we conduct a threat and vulnerability assessment, either individually or with teams, or commission that process and look at what the most likely attack methods are, the most likely threats, hazards, and try and prioritize them. When you've done that, you then look what your key assets are. Assets is a protected security term for people, always the most important, your key operating procedures, your property, your business reputation, but you break down your key assets that you are seeking to protect and you match those against your threat and vulnerability assets analysis. What you would then do is liaise with professional, competent, protected security, law enforcement agencies, your security services, or private professionals who will work with you to give you advice and to develop a plan that's layered, proportionate, and scalable. And the plans, wherever you are around the world, are based on 5 principles, which are, first of all, try and deter threat activity taking place. Secondly, if you can't deter it, detect it as quickly as possible. The third principle is to delay that activity and then mitigate and respond accordingly, so you can go from left of the bang to right of the bang, and either restore operations or neutralize a threat. And then finally, one of the ones that's often missed out is operationally review your plans and event management, and learn from those. Final slide from me, the process that incorporates COVID-19 guidance. First of all, a systematic review of host country, host city, host tournament guidance. There's a raft of guidance out there. IIFX can support you in that, but look at the guidance that appertains to your event. Analyze it, interpret it, and then apply that into your event planning. The Sports Ground Safety Authority was mentioned last night. It's a UK agency that produces the Green Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds, which is the main document for stadia around the world. This iteration, as an extra guidance document from August, goes through a systematic process for embedding COVID principles. Well worth a read. The next thing you would do is look at your safety, security, and service policy. And it's far more than a cut and paste and an edit. It's a fundamental review of that to build in COVID measures alongside your wider safety, security, and service. Look at then your existing event management structure. I've put in the US FEMA, NIMS, ICS structure here. But whatever system you use, make sure you've got a senior COVID professional manager that's looking at COVID policy procedure, working alongside your event management team rather than being in isolation. And then the words that Lou always uses, review, redesign, reimagining your plan. It is far more than an edit and an iterational change. It is a fundamental right of your operational handbooks for your event and then each event management plan. So do that for your event to implement those measures. And then finally, doing that before we go back to normal, before we press the turnstile buttons to open, before we go to crowded space events again, quality sure and test and exercise all of your plans. It is so important, and do that by a systematic process. Use the time we've got now to do that, and you're better prepared for when we return back to normal operations. So that's my part of the presentation on protective security. I will look forward to the debate and answering questions a little bit later. Ross, are there any burning questions straight away? Or shall I hand over back to somebody else?
Yeah, they're coming in slowly. We've also seen an increase in participants. So I'm going to keep the poll open for now. We're creeping up to 50% voted, if you don't mind, Peter. So we'll keep it open for a little while longer. I'd like to move over now to Damien Bush, who's going to talk about real-world case studies. Damien, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there, Ross. Hopefully you can see what we've put up on the screen. So from the perspective of where I'm operating at the moment in Singapore, and I know we had a previous panelist who spoke about the country, we're in a sort of embryonic stage now of reopening and piloting test events. Quite interesting for us, very small numbers, a very cautious approach, but it's how we're living with COVID at the moment and how it's impacting not just the security factor, but the fan experience as well. So for our first pilot events, we're using one of our arenas, a 12,000 seater. Now, we are very restricted in some of the measures that we've had to put in place. And one of the aspects is that everybody that has come to the event is actually on the day of the event been for an antigen rapid test. So we held our first event with just 250 spectators, and they had to go down to a clinic on the day and take part in that test, which can be seen as being a little bit invasive. The other aspect was really training your public. Now, because we don't have anchor teams or tenants, and we're a multi-sports concert venue, as it were, everybody that comes each week's a different patron. So the correspondence that is required at this stage is really key. And of course, everybody knows that half the emails are opened, or the expectation is they'll just turn up and work it out on the day. So that's actually been a big part of what we've had to put through as our process. What we actually did as a country, a small country of 6 million people, was designated certain medical clinics for people to go to on the day, which did put pressure on the actual clinics that we had, something to think about as we increase our numbers. And then they actually brought along a certificate on the evening. And as with many other countries, we have a track and trace system. The aim is that we're going to get 90% of the population on the system to move into phase 3. So that's very much being used. Our phase 3 is opening as per normal. And that's being used as a tease to really advance the nation into coming onto the system. I know other countries have struggled there. The other thing that we have is a pretty good sort of system as far as using the face masks. Everybody is very compliant in that area. Something that we have to think about is actually, you know, from the fan experience point of view, at the moment, we're not bringing in a food and beverage offering. This makes it quite difficult for the patrons as well. So we're offering, you know, basics there, water and so on, but everyone's pretty clear that we're trying to do here is test and trial. I'll just move on to the next slide. Thanks. So this really sort of picks up on some of the areas that Pete spoke about and some of the risks that are associated with this. And this is the patron flow. We're mandated here as to the process that somebody goes through. And of course, through safe distancing measures, you're now extending the areas where people are actually entering into your venues. And all of our venues all around the world are, as was said, some are within cities, some within much larger campuses or precincts, and there's a lot of space around it. But what we're having to do now is introduce new elements. So from the soft ticket check, checking that somebody's actually got their certificate and it matches their ID as well, which in some nations would be seen to be quite an invasive step. So you'll be matching that up. And then the temperature checks, which we have as mandatory. Someone will go through that process. And then we bring them into what we call our normal process, which is a bag check, where we have our standard conditions of entry. Then there's a wanding, which again is mandatory where we are, and there's ticket scanning. So what we're doing is we're adding to, you know, potential congestion, bringing more people into to an area for a longer period. And we know that from, you know, globally, fans find that not to be the best type of experience there. So elongated process, patron flow extended, not such a problem when we're dealing with small numbers, but once we start trying to move up into where we're planning to get up to 500, 800, 1,500, 5,000, and by middle of next year, whether or not we can push the government to get into 14,000, as I say, it's quite cautious, then, you know, we can see some potential issues there. Just on the next slide, please. Okay, so look, this just gives a little bit of context as to some of the space and the constraints that we've got. None of this will be particularly unfamiliar to the rest of our colleagues. Can move down a slide. Here we go, and here we can see what we're talking about and what Pete's referring to, which is really extending, you know, out into car parks, open areas, public spaces, new zones, new entrance areas. Okay, we can move on through to the next slide. Yeah, again, just to give you an idea, we can move through this. Okay, if you just keep pressing the photos there, you can see again how much area is required, what additional overlay that we're having to put in place around the site. Okay, keep going through, thanks. And there we go. This is just bringing in the patrons into one of the entrances on the night, which is 5 different zones that we used. So if we just go through to the next slide. Okay, so look, this is what we're learning from this, and it's been mentioned previously. So the social media and the mail outs and actually telephoning patrons prior to an event to prepare them is pretty unprecedented, and it's very tough for our industry. to make people aware of what they're actually facing on the day. And every country or every state is mandated by their health authority. We have to create zones. There's restrictions on the crew numbers that we had, and this was for a particular MMA event just recently. And again, you're using your venues in different ways, and this comes with its own threat as well, because you're unfamiliar and your staff are unfamiliar as well. Because what we're trying to do is create different cohorts or zones to bring patrons through. Now, as we progress with this and increase the numbers, what you don't have is additional doors, but you might look for other areas and spaces to bring people into your venues if you do have this restriction on numbers and crossovers. So that will present a lot more pressure there. The other thing, because as I say, we're very heavily mandated here, is we're actually keeping people in these small communities within venues, and it's putting pressure on the venue for toilets, medical space, facility management, and at some point that'll be the food and beverage aspects as well. And along with the signs and the manpower, what we're finding is the way that we're having to operate currently is for 250 people coming into a venue, we're having to staff as we normally would for 5,000. So, you know, you've got to train your audience, you've got to train your staff around this as well. So there's a lot of increased costs here, and people are getting used to these new trace together style applications that they're using on their phones. And really the point here is, we're not a security event. Everyone will say that now. It's a very common term. It's the fan experience that we're having to think about. Now, on the training aspect, what we're trying to do is working at a government level. We're now bringing in ambassadors. So some countries have safe distancing ambassadors. These might be people that just go around and ask people to not congregate in larger groups. Something that we've done here is to try and bring through a course and train our staff. So we've now got safe event ambassadors, and that's around the elements of protection from COVID, impacts from COVID, incorporating that into the training. Another aspect we're trying to do, and I know each country, some countries are really struggling to get through to the government. Quite fortunate where I am in Singapore, is bringing in a safe event standard. So what we've managed to do is incorporate all of the different live events industries and the MICE industry, and come up with a holistic plan which we're trying to put through, not just a safe event cleaning standard, but a safe event operating standard as well. And these aspects really need to bring in the fan experience and the security elements. So it's small steps at the moment. There's quite a lot that we're doing, and we're just trying to bring the numbers up, and looking very much in envy at our colleagues over in Australasia that are putting tens of thousands through their venues at the moment. But hopefully there's some elements you can see that we've put in place here, which you could incorporate maybe into some of your venues, or talking to your health authorities as a way of pushing it forward. It is intensively costly at times, and it is staff heavy. But when you're in a situation of doing absolutely nothing, or you can't open your doors, and you want to be able to prove that you can actually push forward and manage with these risks, then starting off a sort of very slow pace might be something that can actually get you to opening the doors at that point. So, like I say, very happy to take any questions or comments around that. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you very much, Damien. I have just shared the poll results, so I'm hoping you can all see that. Can you confirm before we move on to Brian? Can everybody see the poll results?
Yeah, I can see them. Thank you.
Okay, great. So Brian, over to you for the assumptions and liabilities, please. Brian, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you. You're calling on your phone. I'm going to have to call out to our tech support. Andrew, are you there? Andrew, we can't hear Brian. Peter, I might have to bring you in here to go through
Standing
these
by.
polls. Yeah. Brian, can I ask you to log out and call back in, please? That might help. All right, Peter, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking part with the polls. It's just to get some engagement, really, and it's quite interesting. One of the questions we asked was about your COVID preparedness, and a lot of people said they'd fundamentally reviewed their policies, procedures, analysed and implemented. That's really, really good. That's the way to go with this, along with your rest of your plans. One of the questions was regarding the most likely threats or hazards at your events. I think terrorism had 28% of votes and was highlighted in red. You'll be glad to know that whilst I often talk about reasonable worst case scenarios, the likelihood of terrorism at most events is very, very small. It is far more likely that you will have what we would call the standard threats and hazards, such as minor crowd disorder, crowd management issues, traffic disruption, systems failures. That's what's more likely to happen at your events. And that's why we stress the fact that whilst we have to have a protective security plan and liabilities in place, and if you're from the US, you'll be aware of the Safety Act. And if you're from the UK, the duty to protect legislation, the actual risk of terrorism is quite low. There's a great question towards the bottom regarding, are you likely to go to events now with or without a vaccine? That's an interesting one. I think most event professionals are happy to go to events in general. And again, a point I made during my small presentation, by the time that stadiums fully open, there will be enhanced biosafety security measures in place. There's great news coming out from around the world regarding vaccinations. We'll understand social distancing, we'll review capacities, and we'll be in a far, far better place into 2021. So thanks for the polls, really good stuff there, and we'll take further questions towards the end. Cheers, Ross.
Thanks very much, Peter. We've got Brian back.
Ross, can you hear me now?
Yes, welcome back, Brian.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
very much
Thank
for
you.
sorting that out. Over to you.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks to Dr. Liu and to Gary and everyone for having me here today. I think my only concern with the polls is when we were talking about the greatest threats, there were two items missing. Number one, regulation. Number two, Philadelphia sports fans, which is a joke that any of our US attendees can certainly appreciate. And I apologize to any Philly fans. Actually, I don't. But thanks for that. And I would add in for Robert, you are going to have to potentially add in virtual fighting in the stands in order to make it really feel like home in addition to the sounds. So I'll stop with my comedy there. But appreciate it. And this has been a really great presentation. I mean, this is such a challenging issue at this point. And, when we were speaking about this panel, one of the things that we said as a fundamental and as a given is that we will be living in a post-COVID world. And, and hopefully that'll arrive sooner than later. We've got very good news about the vaccines in the past 2 weeks. 2 vaccines with 90+, now even potentially 95+% efficacy, which is really unheard of in the vaccine world, which is terrific. And hopefully we can stamp out this really awful virus in the near future. But it does raise a good question. And if we go to the next slide, which would be, are we still going to be worrying about disease testing? And I think this is one of the risks and one of the measures that stadium owners and operators and facility operations personnel are going to have to think about. Are we still going to look into disease testing and monitoring? Because we are going to reach a point somewhere soon, hopefully in a few months, maybe a little bit longer, where we are going to see a formal end of pandemic or epidemic declarations by global health and nationwide health organizations. But are we still going to look at testing? And that's a really interesting question, and it's a risk because even if there is no formal recommendation that there is a pandemic, that there is an epidemic, et cetera, are we still going to be pressured as facility owners, operators, or council to continue to do the testing or even the monitoring? And I think that's going to be a significant challenge to make those decisions. And yes, you can have the absence of a legal declaration saying that you need to conduct testing, you need to stop doing, you no longer need to do disease monitoring, temperature screening, et cetera. But is that really going to become, are we now at the point where this is a normal part of entrance screening? into facilities. And I think that's a question. It's a risk everyone's going to have to conduct an individual analysis on. And what is that going to depend on? It's going to depend on a number of issues, including what is the number of vaccines that have been distributed in the area? What's the efficacy? What are disease rates? Are we worrying about the next disease? Because I think if anything, what this pandemic has shown is the incredible transmissibility of these diseases. And we live in a world where this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's been striking how bad it has been. And despite us being preparing for the last 20 years or so for biological threats and all sorts of other threats, we really still were caught flat-footed. And some of that is due to bad assumptions being made about the transmissibility of the disease, and also the willingness of people to take measures in order to prevent transmission. I think especially in the United States, less so in Europe, what we've seen is a real stark contrast in people's risk tolerances. As some of you know, I've spent a lot of time working with school districts, for instance, on trying to get their students back into the classroom. And even within the United States, it's been remarkable to see the different attitudes between parents, between teachers, between school officials, et cetera, with respect to what is admittedly and scientifically proven to be a low-risk group, children. And the risk tolerance is incredibly low for children, but it varies dramatically in terms of who's going to withstand that risk. And so we're seeing, for instance, where I am now in South Carolina, schools are open. Where I just moved from, Virginia, schools are not open for in-classroom learning. The superintendent of the Los Angeles School District, the second largest school district in the nation with over 700,000 students and employees, the largest independent school district in the nation, just published an op-ed in the LA Times today saying we need to get students back to schools. So this is a very challenging issue. And then, even if we don't have to do disease screening like we're all scrambling for at this point with rapid tests, do we still do temperature screening? Well, as some of us know, and I think, Gary Gardner has pointed this out a number of times, for instance, temperature screening isn't always reliable. It may detect people who are actively sick, but it may not show the people who are asymptomatic. And all of this plays into a number of other issues, which I talk about in the next slide through screening time, privacy, et cetera. And these are all significant issues that we need to address. So if we go to the next slide, when we talk about further screening considerations, if we want to go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. What is screening going to look like in the future? We've had some excellent presentations about that today, but I think it's going to be challenging, and it's forcing us to continually reconsider and reevaluate assumptions. And I know over the last few years, we've had to reevaluate a lot of assumptions. For instance, one of the most challenging issues that we've had to reevaluate is what are the roles drones can play with respect to facility security, particularly for open air facilities. And there's been significant risks associated with that. There's even been attacks involving drones. But what we have always assumed is that physical threats are still the most important threat. But now, are they secondary? We're definitely in a world at this point, as pointed out earlier, we've had no attacks in the past year. Well, of course, that's because there are no large events, no events really in any way, shape, or form. But are those physical threats still going to be secondary to disease management, even when the pandemic is defeated? And this is a problem that carries over, for instance, with the physical threats. If we are going to have continued temperature screening, if we're going to have continued testing, and even simple testing to stick out your tongue, put this piece of paper on there, not versus deep nasal swabs or blood draws, et cetera, we're going to have the queuing problem. And that queuing problem is going to be extremely difficult to manage if we're still going to do disease monitoring. We won't even call it testing at this point. We'll just call it disease monitoring and light screening. That's going to be challenging. We also, as always, have to remember that the bad actors get a vote. And are they going to adjust their tactics to take advantage of some of these disease mitigation measures? And so now we're in a situation where before, I'm sure all of you have remembered this, where especially if you go into a bank, for instance, it says, please remove any hats, face coverings, et cetera. before you enter this building or while inside, online, etc. Well, now we're in a world where if you take off that face covering, you could face a fine or potentially arrest, depending on your jurisdiction. And that may continue. And I would certainly say that we're going to be in a world, again, for I'll use the term risk tolerant, but I don't mean to limit it to that, or risk intolerant, risk averse folks. Uh, we're going to be in a world where face coverings are going to become fairly normal, I think. And, it's not going to be a situation where if we see videos, for instance, of people here in the United States, if we see videos of patrons in Russia or excuse me, Asia and other areas where face masks are fairly normal, what happens now when we see face masks continue to be, somewhat more normal inside the United States, particularly for those who are immunocompromised or have comorbidities, as they say? How do we adjust our tactics? What does facial recognition look like in those situations? What a behavioral pattern analysis, et cetera? And I think this is going to be a serious issue because there's a lot of face recognition technologies that are out there. There are some concerns about that from a privacy perspective, and it can be used even with face masks, but we're going to have to adjust those expectations. And that also dives into, will existing screening technologies be able to handle the large crowds? Again, this goes to risk management. What worked in 2019 may not work in 2021. How do you adjust for those purposes? And how do you adjust for all of those different issues that are going to come up? And then it goes into what kind of training will be expected for security officers. This has been a big issue, very big issue for security officers and security forces across the country in 2020. Do we even want to do disease screening? Do we want to get involved in our officers at locations where the disease may be present? And now are they going to have to look for disease symptoms as well beyond the pandemic? An important issue. If we go to the next slide, I think what this all really comes down to is what's the new normal? What are the new risks that we need to worry about? And I think these are some of the critical ones that we've identified at the Institute and in some of our other discussions. And these are the risks that, as council, as executive team leadership, these are all the issues that you're going to have to start going through. I just mentioned vendors. Where do they fit into the screening programs? I think next we also look into what's going to happen to security budgets, especially in the era of potentially decreased attendance and decreased revenue. I mean, if we're going to still be in a world where there is still some social distance considerations, any social distancing is automatically going to reduce capacity at most facilities. How do you manage that without physically expanding them to get the same people in? Where are those funds going to come from? Is the decrease in capacity going to mean a concurrent and a coexisting decrease in the security budget, or is the security budget going to remain the same even though the capacity is decreasing, meaning the revenue is decreasing? How is that all going to fit together, and what's the tolerance there? I think cybersecurity measures are also going to be critical, because what about the new cyber threats? One of the most disappointing and one of the most disturbing trends that has come out of the pandemic is the ferociousness with which the cyber bad actors have continued their work, meaning that we always knew that cyber bad actors, hackers, weren't going to reduce their activity, but in some ways they've increased the volume of their attacks, and they've targeted them, for instance, against healthcare facilities during the pandemic. I mean, that's particularly vicious. It's obviously malicious in many different ways. But what I think is really fascinating is that we're going to have to continue to really focus on the cyber threats, because we've seen, for instance, the cyber actors go after healthcare facilities, deliberately saying, we'll shut you down even in the midst of a pandemic, or because of a spike, we're going to shut you down, and so you better pay. That's a really disturbing trend. And so that's going to be a risk that's going to be more important than ever. As I've mentioned before, crowd management and surveillance, how will that mix with all the disease transmission fears? And if, heaven forbid, and I really mean that, heaven forbid, if we do go into a situation where there is a new pandemic, something else develops, if there's a recurrence of COVID-19, it becomes COVID-21, or something completely new develops, are we going to, the royal we, meaning the sports and entertainment industry, are we going to have as much leeway as we've had with this current pandemic. And I know some of you may say, well, we haven't had much leeway to begin with, but I think it is fair to say that this pandemic has really been treated as unprecedented, meaning that the last time we had anything close to this was the Spanish influenza pandemic of 100 years ago. If we get hit with another similar epidemic or pandemic, meaning global, boy, are we as stadium managers, as facility owners, operators, are we going to receive the same amount of leeway in terms of how do we deal with this? We're coming up with a new playbook, et cetera. Well, the reality is that you won't be a new playbook at this point. There may be some changes in things like distance or the disease measurement, disease screening tools, et cetera. But the reality is that I think the expectation that we're coming out of this pandemic is that we have a playbook in place for dealing with these types of threats going forward. And getting caught flat-footed the next go around is going to be unacceptable. It's going to be deemed unreasonable, and that's going to lead to some significant litigation, regulatory challenges, et cetera. So I think that is one of the most critical risks in the post-COVID environment that we're going to have to deal with. So that's the end of my brief comments. I really enjoyed listening to everybody else. And Ross, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I really enjoyed that. Before we move on to key takeaways, I'd like to throw out the cyber threat to the rest of the panelists. It's a really important point. Does anyone want to expand or provide their perspective on the cyber threat?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. Sorry to be greedy. Exactly right, Brian. The cyber threat, really, if you take a major international sporting event, let's look at Tokyo 2020. Without pointing fingers too strongly, the UK and American intelligence services have pretty much charged Russia with state-sponsored hacking to disrupt the operations of Tokyo 2020. So that's a relatively new concept. Organized crime is a massive cyber driver at events, both in terms of, if you like, the ticketing system, financial gain. With regards to terrorism, your key safety features, access features, and operating models are key. So cyber will always feature. And as we become more connected through computers, has to be considered in tandem. So yeah, it's a great point to raise, Brian, the frequency and complexity of cyber management.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Pete, just very briefly. I'm sure we're all reading the news about a friend we all have, Chris Krebs from the Department of Homeland Security, who was dismissed last night from the department. And I think number one, we all thank him for his service, great person. But number two, I think Chris has done a real credit and a benefit for all of us to show that cyber protection can work. The American election in 2020 was well defended. There were really no critical cyber issues. So it's a great example of where the public sector and the private sector work together, that these threats can be seriously mitigated, if not eliminated. I hesitate to use the word eliminated, but let's just say significantly mitigated. And so, oftentimes we talk about a lot of these threats with a sort of morbid sense of fatality, but I think Chris has done us all a very nice credit by showing that these things can be conquered, which is a credit to him and a credit to people on this call and others who work tirelessly to help mitigate these types of threats. But we have to realize them for what they are, serious threats.
I appreciate this is Chris Canan. I'm stepping in for the host duties here, but just to follow up with you all. First of all, the information you provided is just fantastic. On the assumptions that we had alluded to, are you all detecting, as just as you look around the industry, that folks are taking are adjusting their assumptions now even if they don't have all the information they'd like to have, or their planning assumptions? Do you think they're changing those and as a result adapting their plans accordingly?
Happy to jump in there, Chris. Yeah, definitely. You're seeing the from the COVID perspective, the biosecurity officer, and you're seeing venues and events that these staff and there's training that's taking place now, and that's becoming key and fundamental in what's being put forward. Of course, you can't ignore the other elements outside of it, but if I was in that, as a venue, I'd it's something that we're pushing very hard. And if I was an event organizer, operator, promoter, it's something that I'd be bringing to the table at the moment. It's got to be a new aspect to what we're delivering. Pete mentioned it earlier. It's something that should be sitting there within your control room. It's something that should be mandated. There should be someone that has actually got that responsibility and has to carry that through.
Well, I appreciate that, Damien. Anybody else care to comment?
I think it's a concern, really, Chris, that I think we've seen it before, but when something unique and challenging comes to bear, it is easy to focus on that as a main issue. And I think that's really important. I listened to Liam Boylan on the former presentation, so a good segue there to him. He was talking about, for example, senior management staff being reduced through redundancy. So have our key managers got the time to focus on a whole hazards approach? I don't know. I'm really concerned that we focus too much on COVID management rather than the complete range of threats and hazards that have been discussed today. So that's going to be an interesting point and just a challenge going forward, I think, from my point of view in the UK.
Definitely appreciate that. Well, in the interest of time here, what I'd like to do, as we've done on the other panels, is I'd like to just go around real quick and ask you for your key takeaways. What's something you want the audience to remember as we go forward here? So if I could circle back to Jeff Chapman, who's led the day there. Jeff, if you've got just one or two that you'd like the audience to take away, glad to hear them.
Sure. I think what you heard, especially from those that are managing venues and process, is one, this requires money and time and focus. So in the day, COVID has only complicated risk management. And there will be, even if the current vaccines work and everybody gets inoculated, there will be a new COVID, assured, right? And so I think if you will, the resilience of the sports world depends upon the fan. 100% depends upon the fan. And if you look at just the NBA experience of holding virtually, I think they staved off some major losses, but the fan experiences, by all measures, from polls to number of people watching, was not good. And so I think we've got to figure out a way to mitigate risk across the board, whether it's terrorism risk, which I think we've done a pretty good job as an industry doing, to COVID-19 risk. But at the end of the day, if I could spend 30 seconds with an owner or a league, C-level officers to say, don't shortchange your security and risk. You actually need them more than you actually, just because they don't produce profit, don't shortchange fully funding them.
Certainly. Thank you, Jeff. Damien, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, for me, it's very much about the fan experience and the empathy towards that fan, and it's the casual fan. My HQ's in Philadelphia, so I've sat through a few of those sports things, those sports fans that Brian mentioned. Not every event is a sellout, and we've got to think about the layers here and the speed and the cohesiveness of getting people into these venues, but also having the safety factor. And something that I took everyone through earlier was a very elongated process for that casual fan. And coming back to those sports teams or those concerts and those events, for some of those, the vast majority of the event is made up of a casual fan because they're not a diehard fan. So we've got to think about those layers. It wasn't long ago where your layer was that you got a ticket, you can come in. Yeah, and then we started searching people, and then we started searching people for certain aspects, and then we were looking at terrorist reconnaissance. And now we're bringing in this new factor because of the pandemic. So I fear and I feel it's a very fine line for the casual fan supporter to keep them coming. And for me, they make up the vast majority of attendees for a lot of our events. So I think that's one of the key areas that needs to have a lot of thought going forward.
Thank you, Damien. Brian, if I could turn to you, please, with your thoughts.
Sorry, just had to find the mute button there. Sorry. No, I think all this is correct. And I would add to that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that really, I think the biggest takeaway is that it's time to reevaluate the risks and the priorities. I mean, we've done that with COVID-19, and obviously disease management is number one, but when all is said and done, it's another evaluation is going to have to occur. And we're going to have to challenge a lot of the assumptions that have happened in the post 9/11 environment in terms of where the threats are and, what's visible, what's invisible, and what's the visible invisible to try to adopt the Donald Rumsfeld known unknowns terminology. I think there's a lot out there that we need to think about and how we screen for it and how we rank those priorities. And it's going to take a lot of work to not only determine what the risks are, but how we rank them.
Thank you, Brian. And Peter, your key takeaway for us here.
Yeah, so first of all, the strategic doctrine that applies to any country, really, that first of all, your threat assessment should tie into your national risk assessment and then track into a unique threat assessment for your event. Having done so, the principles of security by design, so designing security measures, people, processes, cyber technology, and then as part of that as well, security operations integration with safety and service. And that interoperability is so important. The second thing is to see your operation through the lens of a spectator, really important. Follow what we call the spectator journey from the moment they log onto the computer and buy a ticket, all the way through transport, last mile operations, and to the stadium and back. So see the operation through there. Make sure that your crowd flow and crowd management links in with your protective security. So you're not pushing away and displacing threats and activities and weaknesses. And then interoperability is massively important between both the event management profession, private professionals, and the incident command, police, law enforcement, and agencies. And I've just seen a question at the bottom, Chris. Do you want me to grab that while it's there from Ergen? Or leave that to the end?
I think I'm afraid we're gonna have to leave that at the end. We're gonna lose our time here. So with that, but we'll get back to Ergen. It's good to see him from Turkey, so welcome. But to kind of bring things to a close, first of all, I need to thank Jeff, Pete, Damien, and Brian for this fantastic conversation that we've had. It's always good to hear from folks who are knowledgeable and on the front lines of what the risk may look like. And we're trying to forecast into the post-COVID-19 period. The health, the safety, security, service are all focused on the fans, but they also affect the staff, the talent that comes in, the teams, and the bottom line, when it comes to the financial health of the sports and entertainment industry, which we know has taken a beating. COVID-19's taught us even that the most unlikely of hazards or threats, if they occur, can have catastrophic consequences. And we've learned much that can be applied to our future risk management and event management planning and the management processes. So we're going to just have to say thank you. We do greatly appreciate you taking the time to help us today to get our arms around this risk and the new normal. And I know it's going to evolve. I also want to say thank you again to D&B Fan Block. Your generous sponsorship made this presentation possible, and we really appreciate you sharing that wonderful technology with us. And thank you all for attending this session of the conference. We do encourage you to take time to visit our sponsors and exhibitors at their booths in our exhibit area, even participate in chats. So make sure you fill that digital swag bag. They do have offerings that you can take with you. And you can also schedule meetings with representatives or have a conversation with each of the sponsors. Just go to their booths and join them. And we're going to invite each of you to join IIFX and other sports and entertainment fans and professionals as we build a path to return to work, play, and spectate. And you can find more information about our activities and programming at iifx.org. So thank you all for your participation today.